She filed 21 complaints against my shop, and when the last one finally worked, she stood on her front porch and watched the county inspector padlock the door. 2 years later, her house went to a tax sale, and I was sitting in a folding chair in the county clerk's office with a cashier's check folded in my coat pocket. My name is Annalise Hatch, and if my father taught me one thing, it's that sawdust settles. You just have to be patient enough to wait for it. Hatch and Grain started in our garage in Whitmore, North Carolina. My father, Gene Hatch, spent 22 years as a finished carpenter for other people's companies before his right knee told him the answer was no. He was 51 years old with worn-out joints, a pension that wasn't going to cover everything, and as he put it, more opinions about wood grain than anyone had ever asked him for. So he started listening to himself. He converted our two-car garage into a small workshop and began taking in restoration jobs for antique furniture, chairs with split rails, dining tables that had warped from years near a drafty window, a mahogany sideboard a woman in town had inherited from her grandmother and couldn't bear to throw away. He worked slowly and he worked well, and the jobs led to other jobs, and within 4 years he'd outgrown the garage and signed a lease on a commercial bay in a converted textile mill 3 blocks from the town center. He called it Hatch and Grain. Grain, he said, because every piece of wood has a direction to it, and the whole job is figuring out which way it wants to go and working with it instead of against it. He had that embroidered on a pillow my mother gave him for his birthday the year he opened. I still have the pillow. It sits on the windowsill in my office. I came into the business sideways. I'd spent my 20s doing brand identity work for a design agency in Charlotte, flying home on holidays, watching my father in the shop on Saturday mornings with a cup of coffee. I wasn't allowed to set anywhere near the work surfaces, and slowly understanding that the thing I was doing with my hands 40 hours a week was the wrong thing entirely. I moved back to Whitmore at 31. My father taught me joinery the same way he'd learned it, slowly, with a lot of ruined wood, some good laughs, and no shortcuts. He had a saying he repeated so often it became a kind of background noise in the shop. The piece will tell you when it's ready. Don't argue with it. By the time he passed, I'd been working alongside him full-time for 2 years. He left me the business, the tools, the lease, and a coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Carpenter" that I keep on my desk specifically because he would have hated it. We had 6 employees by then. A finishing specialist named Tobias, who'd been with my father since year 3, and could identify a wood species by smell alone, which he demonstrated for new clients with a straightforwardness that was either impressive or alarming, depending on your expectations walking in. 2 woodworkers, a shop assistant, a delivery driver, a part-time bookkeeper who came in on Tuesdays and Fridays and had been balancing our accounts since before I knew what our accounts were. We did furniture restoration, custom built-ins, and a small line of handmade pieces I'd developed, tables, benches, floating shelves, that we sold through the shop and through a handful of interior design firms in Asheville and Raleigh that my father had built relationships with over years of being the kind of vendor who called you back the same day and never missed a deadline. The shop was not loud by any reasonable standard. Routers and sanders during business hours, same as any other millwork operation in the country. The finishing room had a dedicated ventilation system my father had installed to code, and that we'd upgraded 2 years before any of this started, at a cost that still made our bookkeeper close her eyes briefly when she mentioned it. Loretta Geary moved into the property adjacent to our loading dock in the spring of the year before everything collapsed. She'd come from Greenville, retired after 30 years in school administration. She'd bought a refurbished Victorian that the previous owners had marketed as a quiet investment property, and she'd paid well above asking for it, which I only learned much later. She introduced herself over the fence the first week. I brought her a handmade cutting board, a piece of cherry with a knot formation in it we couldn't use for a client order, one of the nicest pieces I'd made that month. She thanked me very graciously, set it on the fence post, and did not pick it up when I walked away. I thought about that later. I should have thought about it then. The first complaint arrived 6 weeks after she moved in, noise from the drum sander during morning setup, filed at 7:46 on a Tuesday. I had been in the shop since 5:30, but we didn't run equipment until 7, so the timeline didn't even add up. The county logged it, sent me a notice, I documented our hours and attached the relevant ordinance. Case closed in 11 days. The second complaint was about VOC emissions from the finishing room, volatile organic compounds from the solvents in wood stain and lacquer. Our ventilation system was permitted and inspected annually. A state inspector came anyway, spent 4 hours going through every piece of documentation we had, and cleared us completely. The inspection cost me a full production day, $300 in reinspection fees, and a client deadline I had to renegotiate. The client was gracious about it. I was not gracious about it internally. The third complaint was about delivery trucks in the alley. The fourth was about a dumpster positioned inside the shared easement. The fifth alleged that our outdoor lumber storage violated the town's aesthetic standards code. A code I verified with the town clerk had never once been enforced against a commercial property in the Mill District since it was written. I looked into her background around complaint number 7. What I found took less than an afternoon of research. Before she moved into the Victorian, she had made an offer on the vacant lot adjacent to our building on the east side, a parcel I'd spoken to the owner about the year before, a quiet older man named Ray who'd inherited it from his uncle. Ray had told me informally that he'd give me right of first refusal if he ever decided to sell. She'd approached him through an agent, offering more than the lot was worth, and he'd declined. I don't know with certainty that this is why she came after us. I know what I know. The complaints continued, relentless and carefully spaced, as if someone were consulting a calendar. 21 over 13 months. A noise ordinance violation for a portable fan we ran to cross-ventilate the finishing room on warm afternoons. An allegation that our delivery truck had blocked a fire lane, the same alley our vehicles had used since the building was first leased as a working shop in 1987. A formal complaint to the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, claiming our finishing operations exceeded permissible VOC emission thresholds. That last one was the one that caught. A state environmental inspector reviewed the complaint and flagged an inconsistency in our operating documentation. Not in our actual emissions, which tested within all applicable limits, but in how a permit modification had been recorded when we upgraded the ventilation system 2 years prior. The county had processed the modification. It had not been cross-referenced in the state's database, a paperwork oversight. No one's particular fault. A gap of about 3 lines in a form that should have been filed in one office, but had only been filed in another. Technically, it required a compliance review before operations could be confirmed to continue. I applied for permission to stay open while the review was pending. Denied on the basis of the formal complaint still being active. The review was scheduled 60 days out. It got rescheduled. 60 days became 90, then stretched toward 4 months as the administrative queue moved at its own pace with no interest in what was happening to my lease, my payroll, or the 6 people whose names were on my direct deposit list. I borrowed against the business line of credit I'd kept for equipment upgrades. I missed one payroll by 4 days and made it up the following week, but the 4 days felt like dropping something you're not sure you can pick back up. I called every client contact I had and explained there was a temporary operational pause. Most were understanding. 2 moved their orders to other vendors. I understood. I couldn't ask people to wait on an indefinite timeline. I sat down with the team on a Thursday afternoon, near the end of the 3rd month. The light was coming in from the west at that angle that makes a shop look like a place being closed instead of a place being opened. I had thought about how to say it in the right way and concluded that there probably wasn't a right way. I told them the truth. I didn't know when we'd be able to reopen. I couldn't ask them to wait on no salary and no clear date, and I was grateful to every single one of them in a way I wasn't sure I had the words for. Tobias was the last to leave. He stayed an extra hour after the others had gone, and he helped me cover the equipment with drop cloths the way my father used to when a big storm was coming in off the mountains. He didn't say much. Before he walked out, he stopped at the door and said, "This shop isn't the building, Annalise. The building's just where we kept it." I stood alone in that covered, quiet space for a long time after the door closed. I did not go to Loretta's door. I want to be precise about that, not because I'm proud of the restraint, but because it was a real decision I made consciously, on multiple occasions, for months. There were evenings I sat in my father's truck at the end of her block and ran entire conversations in my head. I said every honest thing I wanted to say. Then I drove home and made dinner and went to sleep and got up the next morning and did something useful with my hands. My father used to say the loudest tool in the shop is not the one doing the most precise work. The planer screams, the hand plane is quiet, and it's the hand plane that gets you to the final surface. I thought about that more times than I can count across those months. The compliance review was held 4 months after the initial suspension. We were cleared. The state acknowledged the permit discrepancy was an administrative error on their side. Our operating permit was reinstated in writing, with a letter that was so bureaucratically neutral about the fact that it had destroyed a year's worth of momentum that I read it 3 times looking for an apology before I accepted that there wasn't one. By then the damage was done. The lease had lapsed. I couldn't afford to restaff, rehire, and rebuild a client base simultaneously. The mill building had already been rented to someone else. The machinery was in storage. 2 of our main interior design accounts had moved on. I spent 6 weeks applying for positions I didn't want, getting callbacks I didn't return, and staring at my father's tools in a rented storage unit. Then I called a general contractor in Asheville named Carl, who had used Hatch and Grain for custom millwork on high-end residential renovations for years. I asked if he had subcontract work available. He said yes without hesitating, and he said it in a way that didn't make me feel small for asking, which I have not forgotten. I rented a shared industrial bay on the east side of town. Half a unit I split with a cabinet maker named Ruben, who worked evenings and left the space to me from 5 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. I registered a new LLC, Hatch & Co. No storefront. No sign visible from the street. No public-facing presence for anyone to stand at a property line and catalog. Just the tools, Carl's job list, and my father's recipes for joinery held in my hands. The first 3 months were the loneliest stretch of my professional life. I worked alone most mornings in a space that smelled like someone else's sawdust. I ate lunch in the truck. I drove home tired in a way that was different from the tired of running a busy shop, quieter, more interior. But I kept showing up at 5, and the work kept getting done, and slowly I started to see that the business I'd believed was the building on the mill block was actually something I had been carrying around inside me the whole time without knowing it. Carl gave me more work as the months went on. I hired Tobias back as a subcontractor, then one of the woodworkers, a steady, measured man named Pierce, who had been doing demolition labor since the layoff, and who told me with complete evenness that he was extremely ready to stop swinging a sledgehammer at things. By the end of the second year, Hatch & Co. was supplying custom millwork and furniture pieces to 11 design accounts across 3 counties, operating out of a half bay with no sign on the door. I brought on a part-time accountant named Geneva, who had the specific gift of explaining difficult financial realities in the same tone you'd use to describe the weather, clearly, without alarm. One afternoon, while we were going over quarterly numbers, she mentioned almost as a footnote that a property 2 blocks east of the old mill building had appeared on the county's upcoming tax sale list. She gave me the address. It was Loretta's. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I asked Geneva to pull the tax records. What she came back with was not complicated. 4 years of property taxes paid inconsistently, a home equity line of credit taken against the Victorian's assessed value 18 months earlier, and a lien recorded against the property from a personal guarantee she had made on a vacation rental unit in the Florida Panhandle. The rental had sat vacant for the better part of a year after a management company terminated its contract for deferred maintenance. Whatever ventures she had pursued after Marigold and Rye, after Hatch and Grain, had not gone the way the complaints against the shop had gone. I sat with that information for 3 days before I did anything with it. I'm not sure what I was waiting for. Some version of triumph that didn't arrive. What arrived instead was something quieter. The recognition that certain situations carry their own weight, and if you don't interfere with them, that weight eventually falls in the direction it was always going to fall. The tax sale was held on a Wednesday morning in the county administration building, a low-ceilinged room with fluorescent tube lighting and laminate folding tables that smelled like old coffee and carpet cleaner. I registered under Hatch & Co. Holdings LLC, Geneva's suggestion, so that my name would not be in the room before the sale was final. 6 registered bidders appeared on the sheet. 3 didn't show. 1 opened at $35,000 and dropped out in the second round without much argument. The last remaining bidder was a representative from a property acquisition firm in the eastern part of the state, the kind of operation that buys distressed properties in bulk and flips them quickly. He drove the price to $49,000. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, stepped back from the table, listened for about 15 seconds, and set his numbered paddle face down. I raised mine. $51,000. The administrator read out the buyer of record from the registration sheet, confirmed the bid, and struck the table with the rubber mallet they apparently used in place of an actual gavel. It made a sound like someone closing a kitchen cabinet firmly. I thought my father, who owned 6 real mallets and had opinions about each of them, would have found that deeply funny. I drove to the Victorian 3 days later and knocked on the front door. She answered quickly. She already knew. Word in a town of 12,000 moves ahead of the car by at least an hour. She was composed in the way of someone who had been practicing composure since the moment she heard, and the practice was visible around the edges. "I know why you're here," she said. "I thought it should come from me directly," I said, "not from a certified letter." She crossed her arms in the way I remembered from across the fence line, the year before everything fell apart. "You think this is justice?" "I think this is a property transfer," I said. "You have 45 days before the title finalizes. If you need 60, I'll extend it. Make whatever arrangements you need to make." Something shifted in her expression, something underneath the composure. "You don't know what you've taken from me," she said, and her voice went thin at the end of the sentence. "I know exactly what it costs to lose a place you built something in," I said. "I know that in a very specific way. You made certain of that." She had no response to that. I hadn't expected one. I said what I'd come to say, and I left. Her attorney filed a challenge to the tax sale within 2 weeks. North Carolina tax sales are structured to be difficult to unwind once the gavel falls, and apparently her attorney communicated this clearly, because the challenge was withdrawn before it reached a hearing date. I gave her 60 days regardless, not 45. She had family in Tennessee, I'd heard secondhand, a sister, and that was where she went. I didn't verify it and didn't look further. The Victorian sold 8 weeks after the title transferred to a couple from Asheville who had been quietly looking in the area for a project house. They closed quickly and without drama. I used a portion of the proceeds to pay off the remaining balance on a loan my father had taken out to purchase the wide belt sander and the Powermatic table saw, the first real commercial-grade tools Hatch and Grain had ever owned. He'd carried that loan for years, paying it down in increments. I had inherited the final third of it along with everything else. It had sat in the back of every financial statement for 3 years, like an item on a list that I kept meaning to return to. Closing it out with that particular money felt right in a way I'm not sure I can explain precisely, but didn't need to. Hatch & Co. is signing the lease on its first permanent location this spring. A newer commercial space 2 blocks north of the old mill building, with better loading access, and a back room I'm fitting out as a proper finishing suite, fully permitted and ventilated before a single piece of equipment is moved in. I have the inspection scheduled for the week after the lease signing. I'm bringing back 4 of the original 6. Tobias is coming back as shop foreman, which is the title he deserved 2 years before any of this started. Pierce is coming back full-time. 2 others. The remaining 2 have moved on to work that suits them better, and I am genuinely glad for them. The sign above the door will read Hatch & Co. in my father's handwriting. I had it reproduced from a note I found in the bottom of a toolbox I didn't open until the first winter after he died. He'd written it in pencil on the back of a hardware store receipt, a single line that he'd apparently been using as a bookmark for a catalog, and then just left there. "The grain tells you where to go. Trust it." I had it digitized. It will be on the sign, on the door, on the paper liner, in every order that goes out. I keep the cashier's check stub from the tax sale in a folder in my desk drawer, behind the original lease my father signed on the mill building in 2009. The one with notes in his handwriting in the margins, questions he'd meant to ask the landlord before he signed, things he wanted to verify. Both documents are in the same folder, not as trophies, as the beginning and the end of the same sentence, so I remember how long it takes to finish one. There will always be someone at the fence line with their arms crossed, keeping track of things they intend to use against you. What 2 years of building from a half bay in an industrial park on the east side of town taught me is that patience is not the same as doing nothing. Every morning you show up and work instead of reacting is a morning you're growing in a direction they can't reach. Every year you keep your own house in order is a year their leverage quietly erodes. My father made a career out of being the quietest person in any room. He was also the person every other contractor in town called when they had a problem they couldn't solve. There's a version of that I used to think was just who he was, something you had to be born with, this particular stillness. But I understand now that it was a practice, the same as joinery. Something you develop over years of choosing it. even on the days when what you want to do is something louder. I'm more like him than I knew. It took losing his shop to find out.